Welcoming all of you and of course Ambassador Devre, who is going to speak to us on India-ASEAN relations. I know Ambassador Devre for a long time. We have been colleagues in two different avatars. He was a visiting professor in JNU, and both of us, when I was in Laos, he from the ministry pulled all my strings as a secretary. He has been working with India-ASEAN relations and working on India's policy towards ASEAN and Southeast Asia as a whole for a reasonably long time. And even after his leaving the MEA, he has been deeply involved in very significant ways. But while in service, he has served in various missions. Finally, as a secretary in MEA, he was also associated with the CREER as vice president, vice chairman of the RIS. Then member of NSAB, National Security Advisory Board, and CSCAP. He managed for 2 years or more. And as I said, Director General of Indian Council of World Affairs. He was also the member of the Eminent Persons Group on India and ASEAN, which prepared a report last year, and in fact gave a direction to the direction to the India-ASEAN relations in the coming decade as to how this relationship will shape. Besides these mostly diplomatic related activities, Ambassador Devre has also written books, and I think some of the very important ones. I can safely say that his was the first book on the strategic aspects or security aspects of India and Southeast Asia. I remember when I was in NTU way back in 2001-2002, I proposed to Barry Desker that there should be a study done on strategic engagement between India and Southeast Asia. And 2002, mind it, he found that this subject would not invoke much interest. So we dropped it there. He did that book in 2003?
2005.
You started work in
2003 yeah.
And finished in 2005. Therefore, we can't have a better person to educate us, inform us, analyze for us, and project for us India-ASEAN relations. With these words, may I now request Ambassador Devre, you will speak for about
whatever time you
tell
me. Well, I'll try to be brief. I don't want to. I think we could have more questions answered. Yeah, about half an hour. Yeah.
All right. Please, all yours.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Muni. First of all, I'm really obliged. First of all, I'm very happy to see that he is chairing this meeting, and obliged because despite his 30 hours of flying from Atlanta, he has come here just in time for this talk. And as he mentioned, we have been old colleagues and friends going back to the days in ministry and JNU. So it really gives me a great pleasure. His books and studies were always my source of inspiration and reference, even when I was working on India-Southeast Asia relations. And I think when we worked together in Laos and CLMV countries, I recall the kind of guidance, the vision which he set before us. I'm afraid we could not fully live up to that for various reasons, principally our own constraints back home. And I think that situation regrettably hasn't changed even now. I am delighted to find so many of my old friends, colleagues here this afternoon. Also grateful for this opportunity which ISAS has given me to share my views on a subject which is of great importance to this institute as well as personally for me. I must say, ISAS was born when I was here in 2005, and I recall with that enthusiasm and the dynamism with which it was really set up. I still, the words of the then Prime Minister Go Chok Tong resonate in my ears, when he spoke at the inauguration of this institute, and the kind of road map he set out before this institute at Singapore and South Asia is of great value to all of us. And when I was in the Indian Council of World Affairs, I used to always mention to my colleagues within India, also fellow researchers from abroad, that what Singapore had really placed before us was a very good example. ISAS was set up in '67, and if ISAS was not adequate enough with their huge amount of work which they continue to do every week and every month, ISAS was also set up. EAE, this Institute of East Asian Studies, of which President Professor Wong Gong Wu is a very distinguished professor whom we used to meet very often, even at ISAS. Well, I'll come back to the topic, India and ASEAN, which I chose for a variety of reasons. I felt that India and ASEAN have come a long way. Last December, when the summit took place in Delhi, which marked the 20th anniversary of India-ASEAN Dialogue Partnership, there was a stock taking of what ASEAN and India have done together and what needs to be done in the future. Much has been done, and yet much remains to be done. And when we see that today ASEAN and India, both in their own respective ways, are at a critical juncture. I would venture to analyze it even with respect to their domestic situations, that India is faced with numerous problems, principally about governance. Even in foreign policy terms, there are huge challenges before India. The economic challenge of maintaining its GDP and sustained growth is again a huge task before the country. And as far as ASEAN is concerned, the whole process of its integration, its avowed goal of becoming a community by 2015, which itself is a huge job ahead of ASEAN. ASEAN, in a sense, stands as a very important example in the world on regionalism, success of regionalism, and whether it fulfills that expectation again remains to be seen. So I think this is the kind of a backdrop at which both India and ASEAN stand today, and therefore I felt that this is a time we have to really look at the situation of both India and ASEAN in a very objective manner. India and ASEAN need to also see where they are now going to go ahead, because both have a number of things in common. ASEAN's generally non-military governance, its diversity, its gradual empowerment of its people, its syncretic culture, respect for tolerance and generally accommodation within societies. And India also stands more or less for similar values. So we have shared a great deal in common. And yet, I think today, India and ASEAN need to do this soul searching, so to speak, how we can move ahead, because India has placed a great deal of its foreign policy thinking with respect to Look East policy or entire approach to the Asia Pacific, in which ASEAN was a key element. It's not a cliche to say that India believes in the centrality of ASEAN in the Asia Pacific. It was after considerable thought that India came to the conclusion that without the benefit of the flexibility or the resilience that ASEAN provides in this area, and the kind of and ASEAN was so well placed to handle this kind of very important responsibility of bringing together a number of major world powers in a series of arrangements which help to build stability and peace in this region, that ASEAN should continue to play the role of a kind of a catalyst or a central force. And therefore, centrality of ASEAN in the architecture of the Asia Pacific is very crucial. India has been for a long, long time regarded as an outsider to this region. In fact, till about 20 years ago, when India used to talk of its closeness to this region or its desire to be part of the ASEAN, even joining the limited sectoral dialogue partnership, we were told that, well, India doesn't belong to this region. India is outside. India is in South Asia. It took a great deal of persuasion as well as India's, bringing to the fore India's strengths in this region, which go back thousands of years, to get the recognition that India has a footprint in this region. And today we take this for granted. Happily so. But it was at the East Asia Summit that it was finally endorsed, when India was even invited to be a member of the East Asia Summit. The word East Asia denoting not just the geographical areas of East Asia, but countries which have vast stakes in East Asia. And therefore, the situation has very substantially changed since that time. And yet, the question lingers in the minds of many whether India's Look East policy, which is now almost 20 years old, we have gone over from the first phase of our close interaction with ASEAN to the next stage of developing closer relations with the Northeast Asian countries and Australia and the Western Pacific. Is it going to be sustained? And how and in what manner India and the countries of this region will work together to continue to put substance in this policy? And the second question will be whether ASEAN will continue to play its very crucial role in remaining a kind of a catalyst in maintaining peace and stability in this region. So these are two questions which always keep up appearing before my mind, and I thought I would like to speak very briefly about that. Now, in this context, three pertinent elements of which are of relevance to both ASEAN and India can be cited, and I just put them for this afternoon's discussion as diversity, democracy, and diplomacy. Diversity, because India and ASEAN are characterized by diversity. I don't think there is any other regional grouping in the world which is so diverse or as disparate as ASEAN is. You have ideological diversity or the regime's diversity, which ranges from monarchy to single party systems or to military oligarchies or to full-fledged democracies. Along with the nature of the regimes, there are also different political ideologies which are followed in all these countries. Besides that, there is of course ethnic, religious, linguistic, cultural, subcultural differences between 10 ASEAN countries. And yet, you are able to create this common identity of ASEAN. A similar situation obtains in India. India, in fact, is a land of diversity, and we take great pride in saying we have unity in diversity. It transcends beyond linguistic, economic, cultural, geographical, and different kinds of differences between various parts of the country. Now, whether diversity by itself gives strength to a political entity or not, that itself is a question, and we always, of course, would try to answer in affirmative. But that again needs to be questioned, because there are a number of countries, particularly in the neighborhood of ASEAN, which are not such diverse countries. ASEAN as a political grouping, yes, but its neighbors are not. Diversity has lent certain strengths within India. We notice that in our parliament, in our media, in our interaction within the country all the time. And diversity also lends in some ways different foreign policy outlooks as a country, as India evolves its foreign policy. A few weeks ago, there was a sudden spurt in writing in India about federalizing Indian foreign policy. This was, of course, more in the norm of criticism than actual real state of affairs, but there was a talk, because as certain states of India started dictating the center on a particular policy line, be it with respect to Sri Lanka, or with respect to Bangladesh, or with respect to Nepal, or with respect to Pakistan, there was criticism within the country whether central government is now going to follow the policies of states of India. At the root of this, the problem is again of diversity. And as politics of a country such as India gets more and more influenced by regional parties, because in India in the last few years, coalition politics has now come to stay. It is almost inconceivable today to think of central government run by one single political party. Now, if you have regional parties forming coalitions to run the government, it is not impossible to find a particular regional party dominating or influencing the central government in particular course of action on foreign policy with respect to its bordering a neighboring region. So such situations are also not uncommon these days, even in a democratic, federal, diverse country like India. I think similar situations also occur with respect to ASEAN. If you look at very carefully, ASEAN's own consensus on number of issues will have to be built based on the diverse interests of countries which constitute ASEAN. Coming to democracy, now democracy by itself cannot be the consideration on which foreign policies of countries can be built. I mean, you have situations where a fully democratic country has excellent bilateral relations with a highly dictatorial regime. in the neighborhood or elsewhere. Such situations have always existed around the world for a very long time. What has happened in the recent years in our region, in ASEAN and India, is the springing up of democracies in a number of states of ASEAN. The examples of Indonesia and Myanmar are the case in point. The rise or the emergence of democracy in Indonesia is in fact a very extraordinary development, which has not been adequately perhaps projected around the world, where democracy came after a long 30 plus years of military rule in almost bloodless manner, and within 10 years today you have a vibrant and also fairly noisy democracy in Indonesia. The situation in Myanmar again is somewhat similar. Myanmar is still a kind of a quasi-democracy where the military rulers are still in power, though they are out of uniform, and the process of democratic reforms in Myanmar is now in full swing. Now, with these two governments now in two large countries of ASEAN having gone democratic, and the democratic process in other areas, other states of ASEAN also very actively being followed. In fact, elections in many states of other ASEAN have been very fiercely contested in recent years. With democracy well established more or less across ASEAN, and India going through its own churning with respect to democracy, as I said now, we have a very different kind of politics in India these days. We will be now discussing issues between India and ASEAN among governments which are increasingly democratic. Now, does it mean any change? This is a thought which we'll have to give. How does regionalism in ASEAN develop once you have democratic governments in most of the ASEAN countries? Now, democracies will certainly bring about a qualitative change with respect to interaction among the people. It will be more through the civil society, through the media, through parliaments, through people-to-people exchanges. They will not be confined to government level exchanges alone. And I think that could mark a difference, a major difference between what we used to see up till now and what we may see in the future. With respect to ASEAN, this change also perhaps marks a major influence on ASEAN's own philosophy. ASEAN, which believed in what we call the ASEAN way, what we understood as ASEAN way, and ASEAN way had two major components. One was basically non-interference in other countries' internal affairs and respect for sovereignty. That governed the norm of interaction, intercourse between ASEAN's member states almost all these years. Now, that also constrained ASEAN states from taking certain decisions, and understandably so, because for ASEAN more important was maintenance of unity rather than insistence on certain values within ASEAN countries, which sometimes came in conflict with each other. Now, with democracies in ASEAN countries, whether ASEAN way can really be continued in the same manner is a moot question. And to my mind, it will not happen. So I think already it is being modified. There were instances in recent years when countries like Indonesia or Malaysia openly questioned what was happening within Myanmar. And though there were voices within ASEAN calling for restraint on this kind of criticism, that criticism could not be contained. I think similar situations will continue to occur within ASEAN with greater frequency. ASEAN Charter, which was adopted in 2008, when it was ratified by all the ASEAN members, put human rights on the agenda of ASEAN. And it also called for setting up a human rights body in the ASEAN. Now that again was a very significant development, because for a long time ASEAN was rather reluctant to talk openly about human rights questions. Now all these changes are therefore going to be very important for ASEAN as democracy comes to ASEAN. And India too will have to see how ASEAN way or ASEAN's own norms are going to be gradually modified. India will have to study this very carefully. And in promoting people-to-people exchanges, which will really be the basis of relationship, as I see it in the coming years between India and ASEAN, this element will have to be kept in focus. Now coming to diplomacy, which probably will be the most difficult test both for India and ASEAN in the coming years. One can say that, of course, both for India as well as ASEAN to manage its own domestic affairs calls also for a lot of diplomacy within the country itself. For ASEAN, one can see this constantly being pursued, because every year you change the chairmanship of ASEAN. What should be the role of the new chairman? How the issues within the ASEAN should be governed? All that goes in for considerable diplomatic effort within the ASEAN itself. In India, running the coalition, I think probably calls for the most diplomatic and energetic effort that is required. Because if we are unable to run this efficiently and smoothly, the Indian governance system will get further eroded. So I think a skillful diplomatical management within the countries themselves, I think, is the primary requirement. But that, be that as it may, that is for domestic purposes. Coming to the interaction between India and ASEAN, or ASEAN's and India's engagement within their own territories, both have enormous challenges. Now, India's challenges are today really formidable. We have Dr. Shanti D'Souza here, who follows Afghanistan very closely. You may have excellent economic relations, but does not mean that you will have smooth political relations. It has happened in the past also. It happened in 1914 when the First World War took place. So this is question the kind of a model, even in the joint statement when Prime Minister Lee Keqiang came to India, and the joint statement talks of a model between India and China, in which despite serious political problems involving the border dispute, India and China for the last several years have had reasonably good, amicable and cooperative relations, particularly on the economic side. Now that model has now suddenly come up for scrutiny, and it is being questioned. So this is the kind of a challenge which India has. I'll come to that later. Now, with respect to ASEAN, the second ingredient of the ASEAN way, if I may say so, was the principle of mashwara, muswera and mufakat, means consultation and consensus. ASEAN built its policy on this consultation and consensus. Now again, reaching consensus on contentious issues has not been easy for ASEAN, and it is not also the most efficient way of resolving disputes and problems. But ASEAN has been continuously doing so with the hope that they can resolve the outstanding issues. With ASEAN way gradually being modified, would there be a change in your basic tenet of Muswera and Mufakat? I am just posing this question. The Indonesians who are now taking greater and more active role in determining some of the... Can I just go on a little more, please? In some of the intricate and difficult issues, I think are now perhaps going a little beyond this particular area. When they talk to other ASEAN members, I was told a small group of 3 countries was set up after the Phnom Penh failure of joint communique on the South China Sea issue last July or August, and it was felt that the decisions which this small group will take will be respected by other members of ASEAN. What China's assertiveness in the past 6-7 years has done to ASEAN, I think seems to be changing the politico-security landscape of this region very substantially. And this is an issue for which a separate seminar or a conference can also be not adequate. But essentially, I think all these issues of consensus or question of not referring to sovereignty issues or the ASEAN way, all those are going to be questioned in the coming months and years as one power in the region would continue to be more assertive and somehow change the order that had existed in ASEAN and its surroundings for past 2 decades, which had lent certain stability and peace to this region, leading to economic prosperity of all, including China and Northeast Asian countries as well as Southeast Asia. We have been hearing about the American proposal of the pivot to Asia or rebalancing in this region. Now, rebalancing or pivot also brings in these questions whether what will be the role of outside powers in this region, what will be the role of ASEAN in this, or for that matter countries like India, which have also stakes in this region. In South China Sea, India has also said that it has stakes, it is a stakeholder, because as per India's own naval doctrine, its interests extend from the Arabian Sea, Gulf of Aden, through the Malacca states, even in South China Sea, when India's own interests are involved. So you will have situations where security of this region will have to be seen in a manner which will not disturb this whole region. And why I am saying so, because ASEAN was so far able to craft arrangements, particularly in the post-Second World War period, post-Cold War period, in which ASEAN brought together all these countries of this region on a platform of dialogue. And last 20 years managed this situation fairly well through arrangements like ARF or ADMM Plus, East Asia Summit, and various economic partnerships. ASEAN was in a driver's seat. Is ASEAN being somehow removed from the driver's seat, and is the agenda being driven by other powers today? That is the kind of a situation I don't think will be in ASEAN's interest, nor will it be in India's interest. Because India's interests in this region have all along been benign, because India has no history of any security baggage, so to speak, security involvement or military conflict or conquest. And that being the case, India's interests and that of Southeast Asia have converged by and large all these years. I had talked about, as Ambassador Muni mentioned, in my own study some 6-7 years ago, India and Southeast Asia towards security convergence. I think that security convergence still holds, and in that kind of framework, how India and Southeast Asia will continue to now progress further in promoting this kind of bilateralism, which is marked by that benign, peaceful interests in this region. The challenges are there, quite a few, but I believe that we have both the means and the will to progress on that. On the economic side, India and ASEAN have progressed very substantially. People-to-people exchanges have grown. India and in ASEAN today do not look to each other as strangers, and there is a fair amount of confidence between the two. India has both a role as well as responsibility to this region. And if India tries to fulfill it in the fullest possible measure, then we can look to a period where India and ASEAN together can stand up as a kind of a catalyst or main elements of a security architecture in the larger Indo-Pacific. The term Indo-Pacific, I think, significantly defines the commonality of interests of both India and Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, of course, straddles both the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean, and India has deep interests both in the Pacific as well as in the Indian Ocean. So the term, which in fact interestingly has been coined, I think, by the Americans, has significance for both, and therefore in the context of Indo-Pacific, India-Southeast Asia cooperation becomes in fact even more significant in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you.